some extent, was that the reforms were never given a chance, that Russian democracy was strangled in its cradle by Vladimir Putin and the resurgent KGB. Yeltsin, to many, remained a romantic figure, flawed but heroic, the man who stood on a tank to put the final nail into the Soviet Union. The real villain was Putin, whom Yeltsin had mistakenly entrusted with power when he should have chosen someone else. Furman saw through this. For one thing, he writes, Yeltsin, in comparative perspective, was hardly the dissident that he came to seem in the last few years of Soviet power. Looking at the other post-Soviet states, Furman notes that some, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, simply transitioned their first secretaries into the presidency. But others, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Georgia, elected actual former anti-communist dissidents, people who had spent time in prison under the communists. Russia did something in between. Yeltsin was a member of the Politburo who had fallen out of favor and rebelled against the leadership. A kind of rebel angel of communism, he seemed to many Russian anti-communists like the best of both worlds. As it turned out, this was not the case. The problem, for Furman, was that the democratic movement which came to power in Russia in 1991 was always a minority inside the country. Yeltsin himself was briefly very popular, but the programs of reforms and the dismantling of the USSR never had majority support. That did not mean it could not win. It could win, and it did. A vigorous, powerful minority, Furman writes, with a fortuitous leader, Yeltsin, could well rise to power, as it had in 1917 and as indeed it would again in 1991. What it by definition could not do was rise to power, let alone entrench itself firmly in power, through democratic means. The Yeltsin government, elected during the Soviet period but ruling past it, lacked democratic legitimacy. Yet it had a great deal of moral certitude. Russia needed to be transformed, the liberal economists who accompanied Yeltsin to power believed, and fast. If that meant holding on to power through means that were not entirely legitimate, as Yeltsin, cheered on by the Moscow intelligentsia and the Clinton administration, held on to power through the 1996 election, so be it. Russia's Democrats came to regard their own victory as utterly inseparable from that of democracy, Furman writes. There was simply no awareness of the straightforward and obvious notion that democracy is affirmed not through the victory of any one party, not even the most democratic, but rather through the cycle in which one party is defeated and an opposition rises to replace it. This concept of a rotation in power was crucial to Furman. It was the ultimate test of a democracy. Many countries in the post-Soviet space had managed to do it, to hold an election in which the opposition actually won. Some, like Belarus and Azerbaijan, had managed to do it only once. Others, like Ukraine and Georgia, a few times. But Russia had not ever managed to do it. There was an important reason, according to Furman, that Yeltsin refused to give up the presidency. Yeltsin himself felt personally implicated in some of the actions he had undertaken as the head of a minority government, specifically the signing of the Belovezh Accords that had dissolved the Soviet Union. Their legality was uncertain, and in their aftermath, Yeltsin could never give up power to the opposition for fear of what would happen to him. When he could no longer function as president, he had to hand power to a successor who could guarantee his legal and personal safety. It was not an anomaly or a terrible mistake that Yeltsin chose a former KGB agent to succeed him. In fact, it was perfectly logical. Writes Furman, the transfer of power from Yeltsin, a leader among Democrats, an associate of Sakharov's, and in certain ways his successor, a man who had once had ample reason to fear the KGB, to a KGB man presents an irony of history. Sadly, it was not. The seeds for the rise of Putin were sown by the Democrats of the early 1990s. That is what Furman saw. Imitation Democracy, the development of Russia's post-Soviet political system, in Ian Dreiblatt's deft and witty translation, is the first of Furman's books, and almost the first of any of his texts, to appear in English.